This is the largest truck in the world that you can legally drive on the road, the Ford F650 Super Truck. And to give some sense of scale, this is the smallest road legal production car ever made, the Peel P50. You could park 7 P50s in the same length as one F650 Super Truck, and continuing the what the fuck is a kilometer measurements, the Super Truck is about 2 P50s tall and about 3 P50s wide. Now, the odds of seeing one of these two, let alone both in the same place, are next to zero, but if you saw them together, then you would see the two vehicles which best represent the two extremes of car production, minimalist and excess. Those two extremes also do a good job describing the post-war state of America and Japan respectively, and it doesn't take a genius to work out which word goes with which nation. And while both nations have seen massive development economically over the past 80 years, the words excess and minimalist can still be seen in present-day America and Japan. Here in the US, we live in excessive houses, behind excessively large front yards, connected to excessively large roads, on which we drive our excessively large cars to excessively large stores with excessively large parking lots. But in Japan, the picture is not quite the same. While many people there buy relatively normal-sized cars, over 30% buys things like this. This is a Kei Jidosha. It translates to light automobile, but in the English-speaking world, we refer to it as the Kei Car. For any Americans watching who have never been to Japan and don't quite understand the scale of the Kei Car, you should know that we have our own Kei Car. This, the Smart for 2, is a Kei Car as per Japanese regulation, and now that you have a kind of reference point, I have a few questions. Why exactly did America and Japan grow in these drastically different ways? And was it a good idea for America to be so excessive? Hello people of the internet, I'm Nico, owner of a car that is very nearly the size of a Kei Car, and in this video I want to explain how America's sprawling cities are bankrupting themselves and how we got to this point in the first place. First though, we need to look at how both nations grew post-World War II and why the automotive markets evolved in the ways they did, starting with Japan. So, it's 1945, the Allied powers have won, and the remains of the Axis powers are in ruins. Two populous cities were laid flat through the use of nuclear weapons, and other cities have been turned to ashes in other bombing campaigns. The result is trillions of dollars in damages in a country that has already lost a third of its wealth. So how do you get such a devastated country back on its feet again? American occupation turned out to be the answer in this case. The American government stepped in and disbanded the remains of the Japanese military, and then started ruling the nation through Japan's government. First order of business? Get people making things for people to buy, and get people buying the things being made. Considering the devastation of the nation and its economy though, expensive purchases such as cars were out of the question for many people, and so to keep people from going exclusively to motorcycles, the Japanese government introduced a class of vehicle that was cheap to produce thanks to the regulations on size and the lack of many taxes. This class of vehicle was the Kei Car, and it helped build the third largest economy in the world. But low cost isn't the only reason the Kei Car became so beloved. The reasons go as far as the design of Japan itself. With a surface area a little smaller than California, but 3 times the population, most of which is crammed into dense urban areas confined by mountain ranges, there isn't much use in a large vehicle, on account of the fact that for decades Japanese roads were not required to be more than 3 meters wide. You can still find many stretches of road that are not much wider than a bicycle path. And where Americans often use their large vehicles to trek between cities on a sprawling interstate highway system, Japan invented a far more practical solution for intercity travel, the Shinkansen. Given the dense urban cores, the 3 most prominent of which sit within just 250 miles of one another, traveling by plane with check-in, boarding, and taxiing could often take longer than going by train. And with such an appealing alternative, long-distance comfort was not something many buyers were looking for, thereby making the excess of vehicles we've seen in America for decades unappealing. And when you take all of those factors into account, along with the taxes levied on larger vehicles in Japan, you get a nation with a relatively minimalist society. Compare that to the United States though, and you see almost the exact opposite. Around the same time Japan was starting the construction of the Shinkansen bullet train line, America was busy destroying its train and streetcar lines. Actually, that's not quite right. American car companies were busy destroying public transportation by using front companies to buy out the streetcar lines and ripping up the tracks and giving the space back to cars. It sounds fake, but in 1949, Standard Oil, Mack Trucks, General Motors, and a few others were sued in United States versus National City Lines for conspiring to monopolize. And that's just the start of America's problem with excess. The 1950s saw the start of an automobile revolution. Many people were moving to the suburbs, which because they were well outside of the city required a car to travel to and from. And the people who couldn't afford to leave the city now also had no other options for travel thanks to the illegal efforts of the automotive industry. On top of that, automakers were still fighting to accelerate America's car addiction on two other fronts: politics and marketing. In 1939, General Motors funded a massive exhibit at the New York World's Fair to show what the United States could look like in the 1960s. Viewers flew along guided tracks while being seduced by a future America, starring a sprawling city with highways and personal automobiles for everyone. And you can't blame them for finding the idea enticing, since America had just gotten through a depression we can all agree was pretty great. But while Americans were being manipulated by GM's marketing, General Motors was also busy making that future America a reality. The president of General Motors around that time, a guy named Charles Wilson, was close with General Eisenhower, the General Eisenhower who made the interstate highway system a reality. Now, I'm not saying that General Motors' Trojan horse that's a disgusting motion. Now, I'm not saying that General Motors' Trojan horse, okay, that's an even worse. Now, I'm not saying General Motors Trojan horsed their CEO into a government position to make the highways happen, because they didn't have to. Eisenhower had long seen the benefits of having an interstate highway system in national defense, and he handpicked Charles Wilson to be the Secretary of Defense, the very position that would direct funds to the construction of the interstate highway system.
President-elect Eisenhower has chosen another industrialist, Charles E. Wilson of Detroit.
Now, maybe this is just me, but having the boss of one of the biggest car companies in the world at the helm of a project that directly benefits cars seems a little suspicious, right? I can't be the only one who thinks it's insane to have a car company's CEO working in the government on projects that directly benefit the car company he would go right back to. Oh, yeah, that also happened. Charles Wilson went straight back to General Motors to join the board of directors after serving as Secretary of Defense. The more you know. The last reason America has shaped up to be so car-centric and why we haven't switched to a more financially stable system is because our development pattern has snowballed out of control. America is in what is called a growth Ponzi scheme. A city would build a property and all of the utilities to supply this property, but because the property doesn't bring in enough revenue to cover the costs of rebuilding the infrastructure once the life cycle is complete, the city would just build new properties to cover the costs of the old ones. Let me give you a real-world example of how problematic this is. This is Eugene, Oregon, and the city recently hired Urban 3, a financial consulting firm, to do an analysis of the city's cost of services, and what was discovered was that most of the city is losing money. This is still Eugene, Oregon, but with money vision goggles on. The gray spikes represent areas that bring in more money than they cost to maintain, like downtown for example, and the red marks are all of the areas that cost more to maintain than they bring in through taxes. And if you look closely, you can see how far the downward spikes reach underneath the map. This may come as a surprise, but all of these suburban developments run at a loss, while downtown Eugene effectively subsidizes the cost of the homes of likely very affluent people. The only reason America has been able to sustain this practice for as long as it has is from constantly building new developments to cover the costs of past developments and some flawed accounting practices on top of that. All companies use an accounting method called accrual accounting, which basically means that all of the costs have to be factored in, including bills that don't have to be paid for years into the future. Things like loans, for example, would still be counted into the costs using accrual accounting. Many state and local legislatures, however, use a method of cash basis accounting, which basically means that the future costs get kind of ignored, and this has some severe consequences. Virginia, for example, had $50 million in surplus in 2010 until someone did the math and converted everything to accrual accounting, where it suddenly became a $670 million deficit. This obviously presents a problem for the future of American cities, because if we can't even keep track of the money spent, then there is no hope of avoiding bankruptcy. Now, the solution here is not to shift over entirely to accrual accounting. I asked a friend of mine who's in his senior year of studying accounting, and he explained to me that both systems are actually crucial but have their strengths and weaknesses. Cash basis is really best for overseeing day-to-day operations, whereas accrual accounting is better for keeping track of debt that needs to be paid off in the future. But likely because government officials usually only stay in power for a couple of years, except for these guys obviously, most of the costs later on down the line are just kind of ignored or swept under the rug, because more than likely they'll just fall on the shoulders of the next elected official. And because I cannot expect anyone to care about accounting methods, including the governments that use them, I will instead give a more effective and immediately noticeable solution, which means that yes, we are at the what do we do about this part of the video. The best way to make our cities more financially solvent is to, 1, obviously not subsidize the housing that only the wealthiest can afford, but 2, to instead build places like this. This is on the outskirts of Eugene, Oregon, the very lonely spike of profitability. This kind of development is often described as mixed use in America, and it's unique in that it allows certain types of businesses to share land with residential properties. Where most of the US strictly separates all businesses from all housing, with the only exception that I've witnessed being New York City, most of the world allows for some amount of intermingling. A small grocery store, a coffee shop, businesses that generally don't conflict with the peace and quiet we expect of our living spaces. Not only does it allow us to just go around the corner to grab the milk you forgot to buy, but with the increased density, these developments bring in more tax money, which can then be put into services like the police force, fire stations, or public transit. The reason you know this is the best solution is because America is already making strides to make this more commonplace in the future. The state of Oregon has effectively removed single-family zoning, giving developers the freedom to build whatever the market really wants, and dozens of other cities have followed suit. You can also help keep this momentum going by simply writing to your representatives, your mayors, and other elected officials, stating your support for more diverse housing options, which would simultaneously combat the housing crisis and make your city a better place. Don't let this scare you into thinking we have to take away the single-family home. I grew up in a single-family house, and I admit I loved having a backyard as a kid. What I'm advocating for here is simply adding on to the community by having more housing options. Because the way things are, I will never be able to afford a house, and having spent time in Europe, being able to hop on a bike to go to the store or meet with some friends beats sitting in this shit any day of the week. Wow, that was a long video by my standards. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more videos like this where I explain how the automotive industry affects our lives, then hit that subscribe button. It's free and it helps me out more than you might think. If you really enjoyed this video and would like to help make these videos possible in the future, I do have a Patreon page that is linked below in the description. If I would stop looking at K-trucks for sale on Facebook Marketplace, then I might actually post on there more often. And if you haven't already, go ahead and hit the like button for the YouTube algorithm to help spread this video to more people, and thanks again for watching. Until next time, people of the internet, peace out.